Hey tank mates, Wes with Divine Aquariums, bringing you another topic, another video. This time we are going to talk about aquarium heaters. There's a lot of people who have a couple good videos about aquarium heaters, but there's a couple things that I feel that they tend to forget or probably don't even know about. So we're going to talk about that right now. When you first get into this business, they tell you you're keeping tropical fish, so you got to have the heater in there, and the general rule of thumb for heaters is 5 watts per gallon. So for instance, this tank here is a 55 gallon. 5 times 55 is 275. So what they're telling me is I would need a 275 watt heater to keep this tank at 78 to 82 degrees. Theoretically, yes. But what they're not telling you is there's other factors coming that will affect temperature in your tank. For instance, how cold or how hot you keep your house in the winter and the summer months. For instance, in the winter months, my wife and I, we like it cold in the house. So we keep the heat at 68 degrees. Well, most heaters are predicated off of a normal 72 degree ambient temperature. So really a 300 watt by itself isn't going to keep this tank heated at all. I mean, it's always going to be constantly on. Second thing is during the summer months, we keep it cool. You know, during the day we keep it around 72, but at night we keep it around, again, 68 degrees. So that's going to be very cold in the house. Again, this 300 watt heater is not going to keep this steady at a 78 degree temperature, if that's what you keep your temperature at. The other thing you have to factor in is where you live. We live in Virginia, here in King George, Virginia, so we get a winter. Some days, for instance, in February, one day it was 70 degrees, and then the following week it was 7 degrees. That's a huge temperature swing. So you need to have a bigger than normal heater in there to compensate for that. The other thing you need to factor in, you know, going back a little bit, if you live in Florida, most people can probably get away with it in Florida because Florida doesn't get that cold. Or they can actually use a single heater in here. I can't because we get a cold winter, but then I keep the house cold during the winter and during the summer. And then the other factor is where you place this tank. For instance, this tank here is in my basement, in my man cave. So if I'm keeping it, again, 68 degrees, the basements are already colder than normal. This tank is, you know, these heaters in this tank are going to work overtime. They're never going to shut off. So the rule of thumb is 5 watts per gallon, but that's just a starting point. Another thing you want to do is have a redundancy plan, a backup plan. For instance, in this tank here, I have 2 heaters. I have one 300 watt heater and one 500 watt heater. The 500 watt heater, because basically is the one that's doing all the work, but it doesn't have to work that hard because it's 500 watts, and that's almost twice as many. That's 10 watts almost per gallon, almost. So kind of keep that in mind. The other thing that I like to do is I like to have 2 different temperatures. So if the fish get warm, you know, and they want to break, they can go to another side. So for instance, the temperature on this one, on the 500 watt is on this side, is actually 80 degrees. And then the 300 watt on this one, on this side, is actually 78 degrees. So that way the fish can have you know, if they want to get warm, they can come over here. If they want to get if it's too warm for them, they want to get cooler, they can come over here. So kind of keep that in mind. The other thing about this is I have a backup plan. So technically, since I have 500 watt heater here, a 300 watt heater here, if the 300 went bad, the 500 is more than enough to actually keep this tank at 80 degrees when it's cold down here in the basement, because it's 500 watts. Again, it's twice as many watts. However, if the 500 watt goes bad, this 300 watt heater most likely is not going to keep this tank cool. So I have another redundancy. I actually have 3 heaters in my home. I have 2 in here and 1 as a backup, but also this is for my my spare water tank. You know, when I do water changes, I have a Rubbermaid trash can, and this is how I warm that water up before I put it in here. That's for another video. I'll show you that at another date and time. But the other thing, here's another quick tip about heaters. Most people, one thing that they do is they always take this protective coating off of it. I don't ever recommend that because one, if you have a glass heater and depending on your fish, I've seen fish freak out and they crack these things. I've seen fish, any type of sucker mouth fish or catfish. For instance, my Cory's in here because my heater is set up. They like to sit underneath it to hide, but they may burn themselves. So this keeps it from, this plastic cover keeps it from burning. Also, if you have a glass heater, which this one is not, and I'll get into this one here in a second. If you have a glass heater, it protects the fish from freaking out, crashing into it, and breaking it. Or you dropping something in the tank, saying you're trying to move your plants and you accidentally drop one of your tweezers and it hits the glass and shatters, and you electrocute your fish, and then you have a whole big mess on your hands. So keep that in mind. It protects the heater from the fish. It protects the fish from the heater. So always use these. The other thing, the other tip, this is the tip that I usually recommend to everybody. Most people will take their heaters and they'll set them upright. I'm not a fan of that because whenever you do a water change, that's one more thing you gotta plug back in, or unplug, and then plug back in, and you may forget. So what I do is actually, and with this style of heater, I could do this with, all my heaters sit about that high. There's an air stone right at both of them, so they're pushing the water through. The main reason why I do this is because when I am doing water change, I can now leave these heaters plugged in. So I don't have to worry about it getting too cold, and shocking the fish. Because sometimes it can take a long time depending on how big of a water change and how in detail it might clean my fish, or cleaning my filters, I should say. So one reason why I keep it horizontal is because I can leave the heaters on while I'm doing a water change. The second reason why I could do that, let's just say that since this heater goes into my fish container or water container, I keep this at about 78 degrees. Well, let's just say the heater turns off and the water got a little cold. So when I'm pumping water back in, I actually pump it against that back panel so it's hitting it. So the cold water, since the heater's already on, the cold water that goes in, if it is too cold, if it's colder than the tank water, will kick on and it'll start warming as I'm pushing water in. And the third reason, for instance, my Cory's will hide underneath here. That's another reason why I do that. But also, the last reason why I do that is because if I did have a fish to freak out, they're not going to hurt themselves on this because it's not tall ways, it's long ways. So, now one other thing that I would highly recommend is I don't buy glass heaters anymore. I've broken them, whether dropping stuff in the tank, that's why I said that, or I put two cold of water in another tank and I forgot to unplug it and it shattered. Luckily, no fish were harmed in that. And again, I don't buy glass heaters. I also don't buy the preset heaters, again, because this tank's in my basement. I keep my basement cooler than normal because I'm not always down here. So kind of keep that in mind. So I buy Phoenix. I love Phoenix heaters. One, it's a titanium heater, nice suction cups, nice covering, but it's titanium. So if I were to take this piece off, it's just nothing but metal inside. So there's nothing to break. The other reason why I like Phoenix is because the controller is separate. That's the other reason why I can keep my heaters at an angle. You'll see some people try to do that and they'll keep their heaters, at an angle like this. But this is why I'm able to keep my heaters horizontal, because my controller is here. It's underneath my tank or underneath my stand. So this is another reason why I like Phoenix. The controller's here, separate from the heater. So I usually recommend that people spend a little bit extra money and get the Phoenix. And actually, the cool thing about the Phoenix heater is they do have a higher brand, which is a digital one, and it's a little bit more, set it and forget it. Where this one is a rotary dial. So kind of keep that in mind. I recommend Phoenix heaters. I just recommend a lot of Phoenix products. This light right here is a Phoenix light. It's a Planet 24 plus heater, or a light, I should say. So I love their heaters. I love their lights. But I definitely, if you're going to buy a Phoenix product, definitely buy their heaters. So kind of keep that in mind when you're placing your tank and where you're placing your tank. Yes, the rule of thumb is 5 watts per gallon, but if you're putting it in a basement and you live in a cold climate area where you are going to get a cold winter, then I would probably recommend 10 watts per gallon, and kind of keep that in mind. So tip number 2, have a backup plan. At most likely probably 29 to 30 gallons or more, use 2 heaters. And then see if, not all fish like it. My angel and my discus in here, they love having 2 sets of temperature. So kind of keep that in mind. Where you're going to place it, where you live, how cold or how hot do you keep your house. So those are the 3 main factors. Number 4, keep the plastic covering on it. I know it looks ugly, but if you get a Phoenix and you have a black background, you can sit it, well, you can stand it up, but I recommend doing it this way. That way when you're pumping water in, it's going to heat the water that's already going in there. This is Wes with Divine Aquariums, and as always, thanks for watching.